The Legend of Zelda has over a dozen intelligent races spread across its timeline, and most of them could destroy a Hylian without breaking a sweat. Rock-eating giants, shadow magic assassins, reality-warping gods. But the goddess Hylia looked at all of that and said, "I'm betting everything on the squishy ones with pointy ears." Today I'm breaking down every race in Zelda and what makes each one terrifying, fascinating, or both, starting with the so-called normal ones. Hylians. Hylians are the most boring race in Zelda, at least that's what everyone thinks. They look like humans with pointy ears. They can't eat rocks. They can't breathe underwater. They have zero inherent magical abilities. Every other race on this list has some biological advantage that makes them special, and Hylians have tools, swords, stubbornness. That's it. But here's the thing. Hylians weren't supposed to be normal. They were engineered. The goddess Hylia literally created them as mortal vessels designed to carry sacred relics. The most default race in Hyrule was purpose-built from the ground up for a divine mission that reframes everything. Link himself is Hylian in most canonical timelines. The hero who fights gods, demons, and ancient evils is a member of the weakest race in the kingdom. No fire resistance, no water breathing, no shadow powers. Just a guy with a sword and a destiny that was baked into his species before he was ever born. In Breath of the Wild, Hylians show regional variation across provinces, suggesting a sprawling, diverse civilization. Yet fans still debate whether Link's famous silence is a cultural trait or just a game mechanic. Either way, for a race with no powers, they've been carrying Hyrule on their backs for thousands of years, but at least Hylians can eat normal food. The next race survives on a diet that would break your teeth. Gorons. Gorons live inside active volcanoes, not near them, not in the general vicinity, inside them. They eat rocks for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They're completely immune to temperatures that would vaporize every other race in Hyrule, and they've been doing this since Ocarina of Time. They are the most consistently present non-Hylian civilization in the entire franchise, showing up in nearly every era of Hyrule's history. And honestly, living inside a volcano is either the most metal lifestyle choice in gaming or a sign that Goron real estate agents have exactly zero options. But here's where it gets weird. Every single Goron you've ever met in any Zelda game is male. Not most of them. Not a majority. Every single one. There are 0 female Gorons anywhere in the franchise. No exceptions, no hidden NPCs, no background characters. The games never explain how they reproduce, and Nintendo has never once addressed it. This has driven the community insane for decades. The leading theories range from asexual reproduction, like they literally split apart and form new Gorons from rock, to magical spawning by ancient Goron elders, to the idea that female Gorons simply exist but never appear in areas the player visits. None of these have any confirmation. Nintendo just pretends the question doesn't exist, which at this point feels completely intentional. And there's another quiet detail most people miss. In Breath of the Wild, Goron City's population is noticeably smaller than in previous games. Lore scattered around the area hints at migration or depopulation, suggesting something significant happened to Goron civilization between eras that the games have never fully explained. A shrinking population with no known method of reproduction is a genuinely unsettling combination when you think about it. But if the Goron's biology raises questions, the Zora might raise even more. Zora are Hyrule's aquatic aristocrats, and they've been around longer than almost anything else in the franchise. We're talking all the way back to the original Legend of Zelda in 1986. That makes them one of the oldest races in the entire series, and their lore has only gotten deeper with time. On the surface, Zora are sleek, fish-like humanoids with organized kingdoms, royal families, and a civilization that predates most of Hyrule's documented history. But here's the thing, not all Zora are the same. River Zora, Sea Zora, Ice Zora. These are all documented regional variants with completely distinct cultural traits. The Zora you meet in Ocarina of Time look and behave nothing like the warrior craftsmen you encounter in Breath of the Wild. The Breath of the Wild Zora are particularly fascinating because they've been running an unbroken civilization for thousands of years in that timeline. They emphasize metalwork and craftsmanship in ways their earlier counterparts never did. That's not stagnation. That's continuous cultural evolution happening across millennia. But here's where it gets genuinely mind-bending. In a separate branch of the Zelda timeline, the Hero of Time branch, Zora didn't maintain their civilization at all. As ocean levels rose and environmental conditions shifted, they physically transformed over thousands of years into an entirely different species, the Rado, bird people, wings instead of fins. 2 timelines, same origin, completely different evolutionary outcomes. And that raises a question nobody has fully answered. Are the Breath of the Wild Zora the real Zora, or is the Rito branch the more authentic continuation? The official timeline documentation doesn't make it any simpler. But if you think the Zora have complicated identity issues, wait until you meet the race that only produces one male every 100 years. Gerudo. The Gerudo are an entire civilization of warrior women living in the desert, and they have the single strangest biological quirk in the entire Zelda franchise. One male is born every 100 years. One. Out of an entire race of women, a single male child appears once per century, and by ancient tradition, that male becomes their king. Nobody explains how this works. Not the games, not the lore books, not a single line of dialogue. The mechanism behind this reproductive system is completely unknown. Are Gerudo reproducing with Hylian men? Magically, through some biological process unique to their species. The games just shrug and move on like this isn't one of the most bizarre pieces of world building ever committed to a fantasy setting. But here's where it gets dark. That one-in-a-century male during the era of chaos, Ganondorf, the single most destructive force in Hyrule's history, was a direct product of this system. His birth as the prophesied Gerudo king set off the events of Ocarina of Time, and, by extension, nearly every major conflict in the franchise. The Gerudo's own biology created their greatest shame. By Breath of the Wild, the Gerudo have completely reinvented themselves. Gone are the thieves and outlaws. They're merchants, traders, diplomats. And for the first time in documented Gerudo history, there is no king, no male has been born. A society that literally structured its entire leadership around a once-per-century birth is now navigating life without one, and the games barely acknowledge how massive that shift actually is. Some Gerudo individuals even appear across games separated by centuries, suggesting their lifespans stretch far beyond normal humanoid limits. Their biology operates on a completely different timescale than anyone else in Hyrule. But if the Gerudo are mysterious, the race that served Hyrule's royal family from the shadows makes them look like an open book, Sheikah. At first glance, Sheikah look completely human. Same build, same proportions, same general vibe. But look closer and you'll notice the red eyes. And those red eyes are a warning, because behind them is a race of shadow magic practitioners, trained assassins, and covert intelligence operatives who served the royal family of Hyrule for generations. Think of them as Hyrule's CIA, except way more terrifying and way more effective. Their most famous member, Impa, appears across multiple games separated by entire eras. Whether that means individual Sheikah live impossibly long lives, or they pass down names and roles like sacred titles through generations, is never confirmed. Either answer is unsettling, but here's where everything you thought you knew gets shattered. Breath of the Wild revealed that 10,000 years before the game's events, the Sheikah weren't just spies hiding in the shadows. They were the most scientifically advanced civilization in Hyrulean history. They built the Guardians, those massive automated killing machines. They engineered the divine beasts. Somehow they created the Sheikah slate itself. A race everyone assumed was purely mystical turned out to be the architects of Hyrule's entire technological foundation, and that advancement destroyed them from within. A schism fractured ancient Sheikah society. Some members rejected their loyalty to the royal family, turned to darker practices, and eventually became the Yiga clan, a fanatical splinter group that worships Ganon and actively hunts you throughout Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. One civilization split into loyal servants and zealous enemies. The ideological rift that caused it is never fully explained, which somehow makes it worse. The question that still haunts the community is whether Sheikah power is magical, technological, or something in between. Their ancient structures suggest the line between Sheikah sorcery and Sheikah engineering might not actually exist. Magic and science fused into something nobody else in Hyrule could replicate. But if you think a civilization tearing itself apart is dramatic, wait until you meet a race that literally evolved into a completely different species. Rito, every other race in this franchise emerged from creation myths, divine intervention, or just always existed. The Rito didn't. They were made by catastrophe. Here's the story. In the Hero of Time timeline, Hyrule flooded. The entire kingdom was swallowed by ocean, and the world became an endless sea. The Zora, a fully aquatic civilization with thousands of years of history, didn't just adapt to this new world. They fundamentally stopped being Zora. Over millennia of environmental pressure, the aquatic fish people physically transformed into bird people. Fins became feathers. Gills became lungs built for high altitude. Scales became plumage. This isn't fan theory or speculation. It's canonically confirmed. The Rado are what happens when an entire species is forced to evolve beyond recognition. And that's the part that hits different. This isn't magical transformation. Nobody cast a spell. No goddess intervened. This is straight-up environmental evolution playing out across thousands of years, and it's the only confirmed instance in the entire Zelda universe of one intelligent race becoming a completely different species through natural pressure alone. But here's where it gets philosophical. The Rado who show up in Wind Waker have zero connection to their Zora ancestors. They don't reference it, they don't mourn it. Or if they build their homes on high cliffs, hold coming-of-age ceremonies tied to flight, and live an entirely aerial existence. Everything about their culture, their architecture, their identity is built around the sky. The ocean their ancestors once called home is just scenery below them. Whether they carry any genetic or spiritual awareness of what they used to be is never addressed. They simply are Rato now. Then Breath of the Wild drops a timeline bomb. In that game, Zora and Rito both exist, simultaneously, in the same Hyrule, because Breath of the Wild sits on a different timeline branch where the flood never happened. the Zora never transformed, and the Rito emerged through some other means entirely. Two versions of the same evolutionary story running in parallel across split realities. One race that became something new. It's genuinely one of the most layered pieces of world building in the franchise. But if you think evolution is wild, wait until you see what happened to the Kokiri. Koroks are inherently funny. There's no getting around it. They are tiny leaf-faced spirits that look like someone drew a face on a forest emoji and gave it legs. But underneath the cute exterior is one of the strangest lore inconsistencies in the entire Zelda franchise, and nobody has a clean answer for it. Let me explain. In The Wind Waker, Koroks are a small, distinct group of named individuals. Each one has a personality. They live in Forest Haven under the care of the Great Deku Tree, and they have a specific job: carry seeds across the Great Sea to help forests grow on distant islands. They're ecological agents with purpose, structure, and direction. Makar plays a violin. Linder worries about everything. They matter. Then, Breath of the Wild happened. Suddenly, there are 900 of them. 900. Nearly identical, hiding under rocks, waiting inside puzzles, scattered across every corner of Hyrule with zero organized society, zero governance, and zero apparent purpose beyond giving you a seed when you find them. Same leaf physiology, same connection to the Deku Tree. But the behavior is so radically different that fans have genuinely debated whether these are even the same species. Here's the thing. The strongest explanation the community has landed on is timeline divergence. Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild exist on different branches of the Zelda timeline, meaning what happened to Koroks in one reality may have unfolded completely differently in another. Two populations of leaf creatures sharing a name and a shape but almost nothing else. But that raises an even bigger question. In both appearances, Koroks are canonically tied to the Great Deku Tree. They aren't born. They don't reproduce in any documented way. They seem to simply exist because the Deku Tree wills them into being, which means Koroks might not be a race at all. They might just be a god's thoughts wearing leaves. And if that sounds strange, wait until you meet the race that Koroks supposedly evolved from, a group of eternal children who can never leave their forest. Kokiri. Imagine being a child forever, not in a whimsical Peter Pan way, but literally frozen in development. No growth, no aging, no change. That's the Kokiri, and they're one of the most unsettling races in the entire Zelda franchise when you actually stop and think about what they are. On the surface, they seem innocent enough. Small, forest-dwelling humanoids living under the protection of the Great Deku Tree in Ocarina of Time. Each one is bonded with a fairy companion. They play in the woods all day, and they never have to worry about the outside world. Sounds idyllic, right? But here's where it gets weird. The Kokiri don't just choose to stay in the forest. They can't leave. Without their fairy, they reportedly can't survive outside the Lost Woods at all. They don't age, they don't develop. They show zero markers of biological life as we understand it. They don't eat in any meaningful way, they don't reproduce, and they exist in a state of permanent, unchanging childhood that has lasted for what appears to be centuries. So the question fans have been arguing about for years is a genuinely uncomfortable one. Are the Kokiri even alive? Some theories position them as magical constructs, essentially the Deku Trees will given childlike form. Think less village of kids and more living ecosystem wearing faces. They could be closer to sentient plants or forest spirits than actual humanoids. The Deku Tree doesn't just protect them, he sustains them, he created them, which is exactly why his death at the start of Ocarina of Time is treated as an existential crisis for the entire population. Not just the loss of a guardian, but the potential collapse of their very existence. And then there's Link, raised as Kokiri his entire childhood, but conspicuously missing a fairy at the game's start. That detail isn't just a gameplay hook, it's a lore reveal hiding in plain sight. Link was never Kokiri. He was placed among them for protection, an outsider in the only home he'd ever known. After Ocarina of Time, the Kokiri essentially vanish from the franchise. Majora's Mask, set just weeks later in an alternate world, contains zero Kokiri. They seemingly can't exist outside the very specific magical conditions of their forest. Their story begins and ends with the Deku Tree. But if a race of eternal children tied to a single tree sounds strange, wait until you hear about a race so ancient and so powerful, they literally reshaped reality itself. Zonai. Every Zelda game has ancient ruins, crumbling temples, forgotten mechanisms, mysterious symbols carved into walls that nobody alive can read. For decades, first the franchise kept asking the same silent question: who built all of this? Tears of the Kingdom finally answered, and the answer is terrifying. The Zonai are the most recently introduced race in the entire franchise, and they immediately rewrote everything we thought we knew about Hyrule's history. These aren't just some ancient civilization that got really good at architecture. Zonai technology is functionally indistinguishable from divine power. They built sentient constructs that still operate thousands of years after their creators vanished. They bound magic into inanimate objects. They engineered floating sky islands that have been suspended above Hyrule for millennia, without decaying, without falling, without anyone fully understanding how. They created pocket dimensions, not metaphorically. Literal separate spaces within reality. They weren't advanced. They were operating on a completely different level of existence than every other race in Hyrule. But here's where it gets heavy. Rauru, the founder of the royal family of Hyrule and the first king, is Zonai. That means every Hylian royal across every game in the franchise, including Princess Zelda herself, carries Zonai blood. The dynasty that has defined Hyrule's entire history traces directly back to a godlike being from a civilization that predates Hyrulean civilization itself. Every sacred power, every divine right, every moment of royal authority across the timeline connects back to the Zonai, and we still barely understand them. Their true origin is undefined. Their reason for disappearing is unknown. The full scope of what they could actually do remains a genuine mystery. Are they connected to the three golden goddesses? Are they a fourth divine force entirely? Extra-dimensional travelers, demigods who chose to walk among mortals. Tears of the Kingdom opened more questions than it answered, and the community has been pulling at those threads ever since. That's what makes the Zonai so fascinating. They are simultaneously the most powerful race ever introduced and the least understood. The answers are still out there, buried somewhere between the Sky Islands and the depths. But if you think ancient godlike architects are hard to wrap your head around, wait until you hear about a race so small you could step on their entire civilization without noticing. Minish. Imagine a fully functioning civilization with its own capital city, its own economy, its own culture, and its own craftsmen. Now imagine the entire thing fits inside the gaps between your floorboards. The Minish are thumb-sized, elf-like beings who are every bit as intelligent and organized as the Hylians. They have government, they have architecture, they have purpose, and the average Hyrulean has absolutely zero idea they exist. Not because they're hidden, not because they're secretive, because they're literally too small to see. But here's where it gets strange. The Minish aren't just visitors passing through. They're permanent residents of Hyrule, living in fully established communities spread across the entire land. Forest Minish, deep in the woods, Mountain Minish in the Rocky Highlands. Town Minish, literally living inside the walls and floorboards of Hylian homes. Three distinct societies, all thriving, right under everyone's noses. And connecting them to their original realm is the Minish Door, a portal that only opens once every 100 years. Think about that. Entire generations of Hylians live and die between each opening. Wars are fought, kingdoms rise and fall, and the Minish just keep quietly living among them the entire time, completely unnoticed. And they aren't just sitting around. Minish possess the ability to forge magical items by fusing ordinary objects with Minish essence, essentially imbuing mundane tools with sacred power. The Minish Cap establishes them as the original craftsmen behind some of Hyrule's most important magical artifacts. That means weapons and relics that Hylians treat as legendary gifts from the gods may have actually been built by creatures small enough to stand on a rupee. And here's the part that nobody talks about. Some community theories position the Minish as older than Hylian civilization itself, beings who were living in Hyrule long before the goddess Hylia ever created the Hylians. If that's true, they're one of the oldest conscious presences in the entire world, despite being the smallest. Whether they share any connection to Koroks or other small forest spirits has never been answered. The Minish only appear in one game. But that single game focus actually makes them more mysterious, not less. A civilization that exists everywhere in Hyrule reshapes its magical landscape. Aang remains completely invisible to the people walking right over them. No recognition, no credit, nothing. But if a race that hides in the cracks of reality sounds unsettling, wait until you meet one that was banished into darkness itself. Twi'lek. At first glance, the Twi'lek look like monsters. Elongated limbs, floating bodies, ethereal forms that barely resemble anything human. They live in a dimension of perpetual shadow, separated from Hyrule by what might as well be a cosmic wall. Everything about them screams villain race, and that's exactly what Twilight Princess wants you to think before it spends the entire game proving you wrong. The Twilight Realm is a fully realized civilization. Advanced magic, complex architecture, cultural laws, a political structure centered around a royal line. This isn't some chaotic void where evil festers. It's a functioning society that just happens to exist in a dimension Hyrule pretends doesn't exist. The Twi'lek have their own history, their own grievances, their own identity. They are people. Hyrule simply chose not to acknowledge that. And Midna is the proof. As the true Twilight Princess and the single most important lore vessel for this entire race, Midna's arc systematically dismantles the idea that Dark Realm equals evil race. She's cunning, she's complicated, she's occasionally ruthless, but she's not a villain. She's a ruler fighting for her people. Through her, we learn that the light and dark dichotomy in Zelda isn't moral, it's geographical. The Twi'lek aren't monsters banished to Shadow as punishment. They're a civilization that lives there. But here's where it gets genuinely dark. The leading theory about Twi'lek origins suggests they were once Hylians, people who wielded forbidden magic and were exiled into the Twilight Realm as punishment by the goddesses or the light spirits. Twilight Princess implies this, but never fully confirms it. If it's true, then Hyrule didn't just ignore the Twi'lek. Hyrule created them, took its own people, cast them into a shadow dimension, and then forgot they existed. Called it justice. That reframes everything. The Twi'lek aren't the dark counterpart to Hyrule. They're the consequence of it. And the tragedy is that everything we know about them comes from a single game and a single character. The That's why they remain one of the most unexplored major civilizations in the franchise, their entire history filtered through Midna's journey. But if you think a race defined by exile is melancholy, Ace, wait until you meet the ones defined by being stepped on, Deku Scrubs. Here's a race that the Zelda franchise cannot make up its mind about. In one game, Deku Scrubs are hostile little plant creatures that pop out of the ground and spit nuts at you. In the next game, they're running shops, haggling over prices, and acting like perfectly reasonable merchants. Pick a lane, but that inconsistency is actually the most fascinating thing about them. Deku Scrubs are small, plant-based creatures with round wooden bodies, a single eye, sharp teeth, and roughly the stature of a child. They've been showing up since Ocarina of Time, and across the franchise, they cycle between enemy you kill without thinking and shopkeeper you buy things from with zero narrative explanation for the shift. In some games, they're functionally aggressive wildlife, mindless, territorial, forgettable. Then Majora's Mask happens. In Majora's Mask, Deku Scrubs don't just exist. They run a civilization. They have commerce. They have social hierarchies. They answer to a Deku king. They have politics, disputes, and organized governance. The same species that other games treat as target practice turns out to have a functioning monarchy. And the game goes even further. Link spends a significant portion of Majora's Mask trapped inside a Deku Scrub body, forced to navigate the world from their perspective. It's one of the only moments in the entire franchise where you experience non-Hylian existence from the inside. And what you find is a society that's more structured and more morally complex than their monster classification ever suggested. Their biology raises questions that the series has never bothered answering. Do they photosynthesize? Are Deku Babas, those aggressive snapping plant enemies that show up everywhere, a larval or degenerated form of the same species? The relationship between Deku Scrubs, Deku Babas, and the broader Deku category of plant life in Hyrule is never canonically resolved. The species exists without a clear biological framework, and nobody at Nintendo seems interested in building one. And that's the real story of Deku Scrubs. They are one of the oldest non-Hylian presences in the franchise. They have documented civilization, commerce, and royalty. They've been here since the series went 3D, and they remain among the least understood, least explored races in all of Hyrule. One game took them seriously. Every other game forgot. For a species with that much history, Deku Scrubs are still waiting for their moment. And honestly, that tension between longevity and neglect might be the most honest thing about them. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.